with Glenn Woods.
Since it's the Thursday edition of the Bold Republic Radio Show, we head all the way down to Cheyenne. And usually when we're talking with Wyoming Liberty Group, we're talking to someone like Maureen Bader or Steve Klein. But in this case, we have the founder herself, Susan Gore, on the phone. Haven't talked to you in a long time. I assume that means because your entire staff is on vacation. Would that be right?
Well, no, not quite.
Okay.
Actually, I'm about to go on vacation.
Oh. So how did that work out that you got stuck with this?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, okay.
But before I go, I have to tell you what I'm mad about.
Okay.
Usually when the saying goes, the old wisdom goes, you say what you're going to do, and then you do what you said you'd do.
Right.
But the new science standards are coming up. People have to decide. There's a committee of 20 people, one scientist on the committee, botanist from the University of Wyoming. And the Department of Education decided to take public comment prior to them making any decisions. Mm-hmm. And so about 25 people in Cheyenne went to the meeting held by the Department of Education. And we were hopeful. I think maybe we were naive to be hopeful, but we were hopeful. And when the meeting started, we were told two things. Well, actually, three things. The first thing we were told is that we had to be civil. Mm-hmm. And,
I've met you in person, Susan. You're the first person to stand up and throw a chair across the room, obviously.
I know, but got to watch out for me.
Oh, yeah.
But anyway, so that assumes that we were in need of supervision, mm-hmm. which this crowd wasn't in need of supervision. We weren't kids, but the person who was running the meeting is an experienced teacher. I'm sure he knows how to discipline a classroom.
Right.
The second thing he said is that he was the facilitator. And, what does a facilitator do, Glenn? He helps the conversation, right? He brings out the shared pool of meaning, as they say in business. And so everybody participates, we exchange it. No, that wasn't going to happen. And then he said we were only to discuss process, not content. And then, actually, I had quite a few thoughts on process after I left the meeting. So we were left thinking, okay, what is civil behavior? Is it being courteous to somebody else, or is it expressing a contrary opinion? But nobody said anything. And then they established the frame, their viewpoint. They took quite a bit of time explaining things like the Constitution says that education should be uniform, mm-hmm. which is really tough considering the material they're getting into the school. It seems impossible that they could turn out a uniform product if they're really different. And so then he said that we should write our opinions. Now, I know when my father started his company, which was aimed at a lot of innovation, he put aside writing because there's no interaction when you write. You write something, and then what happens to it? You don't get an answer, and there's no interchange between people. So by the time we got there, people were their speech was already chilled. People were reluctant to say things. And a few made comments. One of the best was Amy Edmonds, mm-hmm. who said that the science standard should be not the Common Core, which was rated C by the Fordham people, but there are 12 states with A ratings. Why not go to one of those? That was a constructive comment. As far as the people there was one engineer, and I have a pretty strong science background, so I think the people there didn't have strong science backgrounds. Anyway, by the time we got to the end of the meeting, there was still time to meet, but the room was just chilled. Nobody was saying anything.
So they figured a way to shut it down before anybody could actually ever get an opinion out. Now, I can understand setting a few ground rules for something like that. I mean, please keep your comments down to, we're talking about this topic specifically. Please keep it on topic, and keep your comments under 5 minutes, let's say. Get up there and make your point. And I would also want to see an exchange between those people on the panel and the person making the comments, like a question and answer back and forth. That I could understand. But the purpose of it is to keep everybody on track and not have somebody that goes off on a tangent, let's say. Not to restrict speech to the point that people have. I wouldn't even want to sit down and write out my question or comment on a piece of paper. I'd rather just get up and say it.
Well, what happened to the papers? The paper was a form that you filled out. What is your scientific qualification? What is your? The second question was sort of embarrassingly simple. Do you think that science standards are important?
Oh, geez.
And
yeah.
The third thing was any other thought. It was a small piece of paper that was to be handed in to the committee, and that they were to read them. We found out later that they weren't handed into the committee. Somebody in the Department of Education summarized them and sent a spreadsheet out to the.
Yeah. So in other words, your questionnaire was filed.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's a typical how a bureaucracy works. Just go ahead and put that in the file, and at some point we'll go ahead and review your comments. By the way, you're only allowed to check the boxes, for which comments we want you to make. You're not allowed to freeform your thought. Did they leave any kind of a box open where you can just say what you wanted?
Well, there's something interesting in business. Have you ever heard of leadership effectiveness training?
No. I have a tendency to be too much of an independent-minded jerk to ever take one of those.
Well, there are different heads that people can get into: the parent, the child, or the adult. And the parent is the one who's authoritative, and you're kind of taking a parent stand there. For somebody who's so independent. You're saying this is how we should keep order in the meeting. Then there's the child. That's the one that would be assumed to be under the supervision of the parent, and that child has to be watched because they might get out of line. And then there's the adult who is pretty much pointing out the facts, speaking to truth, and coming up with good suggestions and solutions. And so, you know how it is when you go out of a meeting, they think, oh gosh, I wish I'd said this, I wish I'd said that. But one of the things that this meeting had was vagueness. So people weren't sure what civil meant. People weren't sure what his definition of a facilitator was. They weren't sure how you could separate content from process. And so, and then being told to write your thoughts first before you spoke, it left things vague. So, and what you just did in your speech was saying, okay, let's make the things clear and specific. Let's set down the understanding at the beginning. But if you're told to be civil, and you might be afraid to make a contrary statement to somebody else's opinion, and that's not civility. That's being chilled. You need to be polite when you express your opinion. It's
maybe I don't know. When I look at public meetings today, especially when you're dealing with not just panel, but let's say when bureaucracy has to have some kind of a public meeting, it seems to me like they throw up their hands and reluctantly hold the meeting. A lot of times they're scheduled at times when most people can't show up. It's not like they want to have a public comment period. It's just that's the law. They have to have a public comment period. So they go ahead and open it up at the worst possible time for everybody to show up, and then it sounds to me in this case, try to set it up in a way where you don't want to say anything.
Yeah, you have the story. That's what they did. And as I said at the beginning of the interview, it's good to say what you're going to do and then do it in a manner that fulfills that. And so what they did is they said they were going to take public comment, but the process of doing it, they chilled public comment.
Right. Wouldn't it be interesting and I don't know because I've never seen it done this way before, but I'm just trying to think outside the box here, to have your official meeting, but then afterwards, quite literally, just have a room where there's a lot of refreshments and very little for chairs. It's mostly just people standing around with whomever's on the panel, whatever the panel might be made up of. So you feel comfortable in just walking up to them and engaging them in a conversation. I mean, what if you held your meeting that way?
Well, I'd like you to be the facilitator, Glenn.
Yeah. Well, I just think that makes a lot of sense, because in a relaxed atmosphere, people would have no problem walking up even to the governor, with quite literally like a drink and an hors d'oeuvre, and just walking up and saying, well, you know what I think about that? And they can get into a real dialogue about it. We might just actually accomplish more that way.
Well, it does take two.
Yeah.
And so the other person, as we know most in our life, there are many cases where we can't have that kind of conversation. But what you're describing is the way things really need to happen for a democracy, for the voice of the people to be heard.
Yeah.
And the more we have of that, I just read a book called End of Conversation or End of Discussion, and it describes another way to chill speech. It says that if somebody says something contrary to you throw an outrage circus.
Yeah.
And at this meeting, there was an almost outrage circus. There was a teacher from the University of Wyoming who, at the Department of Education, who's in charge of science curriculum for the elementary school. And one of the things, the elephant in the room, was that we were not discussing climate change.
Yeah.
So she referred to it, and she said, the science is incontrovertible. I don't think she used that big a word, but she said there's no argument about the science. The science is settled. Mm-hmm. And then she says everything, anytime you want to discuss it, it's just politics. Well, if you know anything about science, you know that science can never be settled. It's always an ongoing discussion.
Right. Those kind of statements are made by people that they know they've lost the argument and the debate is raging. So they can't engage you. Instead, they have to shut you up before you can, shoot them down in the middle of the argument. I don't want to mix my metaphors here, but you know where I'm going. They want to shut you up before you can go ahead and out argue them.
Yes. And I think the more we understand these manipulations, the better we can make our voice heard, and that we shouldn't be discouraged by this, because what this created in the meeting was apathy. Right. People just shut up.
Well, hang on. I got some more questions for you on this. I'm talking with Susan Gore from Wyoming Liberty Group. More in just a moment. Back down to Cheyenne, Wyoming we go, where Susan Gore, founder of Wyoming Liberty Group, is standing by. Susan, on the video stream comes the question, what meeting were you at? Christine missed that part of it, that they were doing all they could to try to, I would say, embarrass people into not speaking in the first place.
Well, the Department of Education held 3 meetings, one in Casper, one in Cheyenne, and one in Evanston, to take comments. And there were about 25 people at the meeting. It wasn't a panel meeting.
Okay. Well, now I've noticed, I encourage people all the time, please get involved. Please show up. Please go to the meetings. There's also some people that I know in Casper, Wyoming, who go to city council meetings there and complain that the city council will drag the meeting out to the last possible minute and then just leave a few minutes for people to get up and make some comments, but they don't have much time to actually make the comments. So that means here you have a city council, if this is true, that once again just doesn't want to hear what the public actually has to say. So what do we do to change that?
Well, Wyoming Liberty Group started the Pillar of Law Institute, and that we focus on free speech against campaign reform efforts. In other words, they try to shut up political speech. And they do it through over-regulation. Like if you want to speak, you have to get permission from the government. You have to make reports. It gets expensive. You have to hire a lawyer, depending on how you set up your organization. So we were influential in getting Citizens United passed, which allows grassroots people to associate with one another and to speak out as a group. And that's freed a lot of speech up. But the political speech, continues to be attacked. And one of the things they say is they want to get rid of, quote unquote, corruption, and that money in politics is dark money, and it brings corruption, and we must disclose. And by the way, it puts the censors in control.
Right.
I think that people should keep in mind that the true corruption is this kind of manipulative game to shut people up.
Yeah, well, when you were saying that, my first thought was, okay, so the very people who make money off of politics and influence in politics don't want you to influence politics with your money.
Well, I just read a study on how influential is money in politics, and the answer is very little.
Mm-hmm.
If a wealthy person pours money in, they don't have any better chance of winning.
Right.
And if you have a certain amount, you need a certain amount. Like maybe in Wyoming, it's $1,500 to run for legislature. I don't know. Maybe that's a house, and maybe it's a little higher than that. But you don't. But any much more doesn't really help.
Yeah. See, I've met, and I know you know these people too. I've seen plenty of people over the years who did not have a lot of money, but were able to win the campaign. So the big money doesn't always win.
No, and you can't really, one of the reasons is that people kind of make up their minds anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You may think you can buy a vote, but it's, maybe you can get some name recognition out there, but once that happens, people are pretty independent, surprisingly independent. At least that's what this study found.
Well, now it seems to me, in the couple minutes we have remaining here, that I'm cynical about it. I'll admit it, Susan. I'm cynical about this. I don't see that, again, the bureaucrats and politicians really want a public comment period. If they could just get rid of it, they would, but they have to do it. So since we're not going to convince them to make it a more open time, how do we make this a more open time so the public can get in and say what needs to be said?
Well, you have to talk. The thing you suggested before, you do need to have informal connections with people, especially in Wyoming.
Right.
And when people begin to trust each other, they can speak about things. Sometimes I think there's some very bad stuff coming up for Wyoming now, especially with spending.
Mm-hmm.
But that one-on-one is good, or talking to your legislature, and then doing your grassroots organization where you have a more influence on the vote.
Right.
And speaking out, letting your voice be heard.
Okay. Well, speaking of which, where can people find out more about your group and all the great writers that you have there?
Well, we'd love them to come to our site, whyliberty.org, www.whyliberty.org.
Okay. Where are you going on vacation?
I'm going to do a trip around the West, and then I'm going to go to France.
Oh, that sounds so good. I'll be stuck here. Think of me, huh? Okay.
I'll think of you. Okay.
Thanks for coming on, Susan. I appreciate it.
Bye.